Good morning.
Morning, Lauren.
Hello.
Getting my headset set up. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Great. How are you all?
we are well.
Okay, let's give everyone a minute.
Are you all in different places?
Oh, yeah. I'm in Arizona, 7 a.m.
Oops.
Oops. Veronica and I were in New York City.
Okay. Yeah.
Actually, that's a great segue. I wanted to actually open the session asking everyone to tell us who they are in the chat, where they're joining us from, maybe what the weather is like over there. We need some light topics after the last week events. But we still need to wait for a few more people to join. Nancy, you're recording already?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, and we have the slides.
Started the recording.
Perfect. Thank you, Nancy. Great, Jill, welcome. Happy it's a sunny day in Denver. It's quite nice in New York as well, but very windy.
After many months of not being perfect, it's not perfect, so that's great.
Yeah, yeah.
What are you expecting?
Well, it's really hot here in the summer.
Yeah. Is it still warm then?
It's quite nice. It gets into the low 20s.
Okay.
Afternoon.
No, that's nice.
Hi, Ken. Nice to see you. Everybody's got good weather right now.
Mm-hmm. All right, everyone is ready, I feel. Do you think we should start?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so
3 minutes after is a usual sort of midpoint of people entering.
right, yes.
Mm.
So just so you know, all Tessa, your regular host, is currently working abroad, so she'll be back soon. But today, Nancy, Veronica, and I will fill in. We are recording this session. As you know, hopefully you know, both recordings are then available on our YouTube channel. If you didn't know, we have a YouTube channel, now you know, it's called NATURA Net. I have to say there is a bit of a backlog in terms of uploads of the latest recordings, but we will address this. So welcome to our new NATURA webinar, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Please use the chat to tell us who you are, where you're joining us from. Today's session is a bit of a special one because we are presenting a book that was published earlier this year and entitled Making Nature Social. So I will let Veronica introduce the author, today's speaker. Over to you, Veronica.
Thank you. So today's speaker is Rembrandt Zegers. He is an expert with the UN Harmony with Nature program. Rembrandt has worked for many years as an organizational management consultant. And over the last years, he's been working on this book, trying to understand the relationship between humans and the natural environments, especially through the senses, and how this creates relationships of reciprocity. So we are very interested in hearing the contents of your book, Rembrandt. So I'll just pass it on to you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. It's a great opportunity. Thanks for being here, and happy everybody's joining. I spoke. I call this presentation "Invisible Nature." It's about the book, as you said, and I think it's important to keep in mind why I speak about invisible nature, because the nature of the research that I write about in the book is psychosocial in connection to phenomenology. So basically, I'm a bit of a weird creature that combines biology, psychology, and phenomenology. And that's been important to do this research and to write this book about our relationship to nature. So if I say a relationship to nature, I mean quite literally how in a way we connect to nature, how in a way we engage with nature, how in a way we communicate with nature. That was the question I had from the outside. I'll say a bit more about that. So in this presentation, I will briefly go into where the research interest came from, and then tell you how I did the research and a little bit about the outcomes, because there are specific outcomes that describe different kinds of relating to nature, but I'll come to that. I've always been interested in the psychology and sociology of how we are in the world. I guess that's not exceptional. And it comes with a certain curiosity to deep dive, grasp what's going on and why. It took me a long time, however, to start to see and understand. Sorry. Oh, okay. It took me a long time, however, to start to see and understand how my own being in the world is depending on context, on the social situation I'm in and who I'm with. Not a surprise that took a long time, as I'm also brought up with the idea that I'm my own master and can totally decide for myself who I am and what I will do. However, having participated in group learning exercises in my consulting career between 2000 and 2010, I started to see the influence of the environment, nature, if you like, on the outcome of such learning. It mattered if one organized such learning in an office or, for instance, in a forest. I started to see that the outcome would be different on an unconscious level because it was clear, but it wasn't immediately addressed. And it wasn't the idea either to have a different learning depending on where we were. These kind of learning exercises thought that the learning would only happen between the people, but actually I started to be curious, maybe nature plays a role in this. So then my interest and curiosity was with the question, as a consultant, how leaders in businesses are influenced by nature and by a relation to nature. This was further enhanced because of working for Greenpeace International as an internal organizational development consultant, where campaigners always said, we are the voice of nature. And I thought, well, that's great. I like that. That's why I also joined. But then I asked, okay, but how do you know that you are? And has nature chosen you specifically, or does nature speak to you more than to others? Those were questions that most of the time people did not answer or didn't know the answer to. So my original interest in this research that I did in England, University of the West of England, PhD, and the book relating to nature is largely because I felt that the relationship is never discussed. It's largely absent from socio-economic thinking, and it's not valued in most professional working cultures and how they are reproduced. So I assume this to illustrate the culture-nature split in Western thinking. As long as that split continues, our existence is at stake, I feel, as the sustainability crisis demonstrates. So in the research, we go to the to the core of phenomenology. And so the question is also, do we need the body to solve the sustainability crisis? I argue that the body plays a big role. So what I will mainly do in this presentation is to present an example and show you the analysis along the psychosocial, the psychological, and another along the line of phenomenology. And there are differences, but in order to understand relating to nature, or the relationship to nature, as I was interested in, I felt I needed both. I'll come to that. I question current socio-psychological ontologies and epistemologies to be able to solve the culture-nature split. So I'm saying this split cannot only be understood from a psychological or sociological position. I'm stating that as long as we do not understand that split and address it, we will not be successful in working through our current existential crises. From here, I argue researching relating to nature needs cooperation, or at least a conversation between the psychosocial and the phenomenological approach of researching relating to nature. Now I'm going to move my sheet. Here's an example from the research. I interviewed in the end 15 people, distributed over 5 different practices. This example comes from the practice of herding. I interviewed herders who take sheep or cows on the Alps. Alps are high mountains in the center of Europe. So one day a local farmer told him about the rumor of a dam to be built in the area. The next season, on the same Alp, he spotted a group of engineers measuring the mountain slopes. He asked what they were doing and found it was a team gathering information in preparation for dam building. They were making small explosions in order to find out about the composition and strength of the rock, for that part of the Alp was to become a lake with a power station producing electricity. Daniel, the name of the herder, fictitious, gave a lively account of him protesting and demanding to see the bosses as he told this story. He explained how, after initial uncertainty, felt he had to organize the locals to prevent this dam building. As Daniel, the herder, told me many details, what he emphasized was the reluctance of the farmers and local villagers to protest, even if they didn't support the build. They felt it wasn't possible to oppose the authorities, a very powerful electricity board operating a large part of the country that also supported communities directly in many ways, sponsoring football teams, etc. Later in life, when he applied to manage a project, he was recognized as the campaigner and he was refused a role. Daniel told me one person in particular still remembered him, how he organized protest and held it against him, and in the end being successful in stopping the dam to be built. This is context of a story of somebody who was quite young and aspired to be free in the mountains, and one day with a friend said, okay, we will become herders. So he went up to the mountains and engaged with farmers, and in the end, one farmer trusted them enough to take the sheep up, or the cows actually, up into the mountain. The story is that he was a herder for 5 to 6 years, and this episode with engaging people who wanted to build a dam made him aware that he had totally fallen in love with the place, and that he felt it was his place and that he had to protect it, because it was also the place for the sheep, for the cows. And he was really, really angry and moved because of what he witnessed with people wanting to destroy the Alp. So there's an origin of becoming an activist, and that origin clearly comes from being in nature for many years in a row. but only in the summer. And one of the other things that he explained was that he and his colleagues, after coming back from the mountain, having been there for 3 months or 4 months on a row, mostly by themselves, they had to adjust back in the village, in the valley, with other people in the city or a little village, because they could not otherwise survive if they didn't take some time to recuperate from having been on the mountain and having adjusted themselves totally, being open with their perception. So they felt that in order to do the job, they had to use their eyes, their ears, their smell, everything, their bodies, to do the job and to be with the cows and the dogs. And then coming back in the winter, they always felt that they needed 2 to 3 weeks to sort of close down in order to adjust themselves to the way perception is used in a city or in a town. Now, if you look at the motives or the reason why he became a campaigner, you can do that in a psychosocial way, or you can do that in a phenomenological way. I'll briefly do both. So if you look psychosocially into the narrative, you find a story of an individual with a particular history and being an actor within social norms and being part of certain discourse and a certain history and certain upbringing. So Daniel had a different life as a boy compared to his peers, as his father worked for an airline company and they frequently had holidays abroad. He had seen more of the world with a sense of freedom of travel as a boy than most others, probably in a lifetime. He told me he had loving parents and at the same time bound by strict Protestant ethic and ideas about citizenship. He also told me his parents were committed to not accepting injustice, his father being anti-Nazi and his mother supporting women in emancipation. The story of his dad's moral compass Daniel shared with me was when already much later in life, he only once, he smiled, consulted his father on a delicate matter. This was in an hour of despair where he contemplated on staying with his partner or not. His father left the decision to him, while at the same time stating that Daniel, a man, is responsible to follow through his duties. If you, I have more here, but probably not enough time for that. The point is of doing a psychosocial analysis of why he became a campaigner and why he wanted to stand up to the people building the dams, etc., is that through the psychosocial, you start to see all these elements of Daniel's upbringing, and you could look and interpret some of these events as reasons why he became a campaigner, like, for instance, not accepting injustice, or this experience with his father who said a man is responsible to follow through his duties. So I'm not saying I'm telling the truth here, but I'm just giving this as an example of how a psychosocial lens helps to investigate relating to nature. But as you hopefully can follow me in this example, it is, if you do the psychosocial analysis or interpretation, you find strong causes or potential causes why he becomes a campaigner, but there's something missing, and that's where the phenomenological lens comes. So if you look phenomenologically into the narrative, I find a different story. I find a story of being called by nature, almost like as if nature tells him, hey, you need to go to the dam builders and you need to tell them off and stop this, because you are now the guy who can protect us. Like, so different parts of the story now. For instance, every morning, and this is Daniel speaking again, every morning my arms were totally lame. They were paralyzed from doing that strong work to be able to bring the cows home. Every morning at 4 o'clock, I had to go first to the well to put my arms into the cold water to bring the feeling back to my fingers. It was a Sunday evening, and I realized, it's too much, I cannot bear it. And then a voice to my back said, oh, you'll see, after 1 month it will be much better. I didn't realize that a young farmer came up to me, and he must have stood there for a while, seeing me cry. That was Daniel. So his first season as a herder, he came close to collapse, having learned to value responsibility in his family, the psychosocial. His loyalty towards the farmers helped him to keep going, take care of the livestock, and make a good product. But there was something else happened as he started to shift gear. Again, a moment of despair, this time because of physical collapse caused by nature. At that point, he realized he needed to accept the learning from the farmers and the non-human animals, the cows, themselves, through observation, through learning to relate to nature. He started to mastering some skills and learning about managing cows, how cows behave, how nature behaves through the seasons. Once mastering the basic skills allowed for the start of wanting to do something original and different. He genuinely enjoyed the lifestyle, getting attached to life on the Alp, to nature. He was observing all the time, writing articles, handing them to passers-by to post at the next village. He made drawings, and he later wrote, with several others, the first practical handbook of the skills of herding high up in the Alps. So in showing a little bit of this kind of analysis, it has a different focus, it has a different lens. So with the phenomenology, and I guess some of you, if not all of you, are familiar with that, is that you look at the phenomenon itself, keeping your interpretation or your explanation of what it is as long, postpone it as long as possible, and look at the total context, total situation, and almost sense the interpretation through your own body. And there's not enough time to explain that, but I like to refer to a guy called Eugene Gantlin, who speaks of felt sense. I've practiced this a lot, and the way I interpreted this, the second part of the analysis, was also through using this Gantlin idea of the felt sense, which basically means you let it in, and it sounds a bit magical, but at some point you get ideas through feeling that you can test then later on, of course, because you need to validate them. But the point here is that I felt I needed this kind of analysis as well in order to say something about these cases and these people I interviewed, and something about relating to nature or building a relationship. So in this sheet, you see that as a summary, some explanation about the psychosocial lens and some explanation about the phenomenological lens. What I further did with in this research, but unfortunately we can't go into that in too much depth, is to look at ideas or frames or theory about the self. And the interesting thing is that if you look multicultural and also include indigenous cultures, you find very different ideas about what the self actually is. So to keep it a bit short, if you include indigenous understanding of relating to nature, you feel and you get confirmation of more like this phenomenological position or the phenomenological interpretation, that basically you are not an individual that can think up the world from behind the desk, which of course is the famous Descartes cogito ergo sum, thinking that we can explain or that we can make the world through our brains, through our cognition. And you can clearly see, and you can read in my book, that a lot of psychology in Western world is still borrowing that or still built on that. Whereas if you look at explanation of self, identity coming from indigenous culture, you find much more how yourself could be an instrument of an instrument, but it's a lot about being connected or being part of a larger whole. So I'm going to close. How much time do I still have?
If you want to go further, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes is good.
Okay. I will show you a couple of things that I found. I hope I have been more or less inspirational enough to tell a little bit about the difference between the psychosocial and the phenomenological. So I'm going to say a few things about what actually the findings are, and then also end with kind of a takeaway. So if we go to, yeah, no, sorry, I need to skip this. Apologize for the, yeah, so here we go. From these interviews, 15 people distributed different practices. So there was a practice of taking other people into nature. That's our quests. A lot of services you can find here in Europe as well. You can just subscribe, you pay some money, and you're taken into nature for an experience, for well-being, or for resting. That was one kind of practice where I interviewed several people. Then there was a practice of taking people into a kind of exercise with animals. In the Netherlands, especially in the care sector, you find people that know about horses, and you can be invited to work with a horse, not to learn to ride it, but just be with the horse and explore how you relate to the horse or the horse relates to you. I think a bit more popular or famous is taking children in the water with dolphins. It's kind of the same idea. So that was a second practice where I interviewed people. The third practice was place-bound. So I interviewed people that worked in flood areas, or again in the Alps where the snow disappears. And then what do you do for sustenance or for income? Because most of the people in the Alps, high Alps, have a living because of tourism. So if you don't have snow, you won't have tourists. So what do you do? A fourth practice was advocacy. Of course, I knew about Greenpeace people, but I found other people as well that I interviewed in order to understand how their relation or their idea about nature influenced them in their campaign work. And the fifth one was a bit of a strange one because I met many people that shifted careers, like people that worked for corporates and then wanted to become a campaigner for Greenpeace or whatever. So there's a fifth category where I found people that wanted to do good and they didn't want to work for corporates anymore, and then wanted to work for NGOs. I interviewed several people in that category as well. Interesting enough, there's also people moving from NGOs into corporates, but that's another story. Okay, so these categories, and then almost like 3 people for each category, and most people have been interviewed several times. So it's a bit of a categorization or a summing up, but these are findings that you can also read in the book. So if you analyze these interviews, and it was narratives in, I wasn't asking straightforward questions like how old are you, or do you think nature is good or bad? They were open questions. I always asked them the opening question: can you tell me how it came about that you are doing what you are now doing? So that's an invitation to a story about their own life. And then in using both the psychosocial and the phenomenological way of analysis, I came to these results, and I'll mention a few. So the first thing that became clear to me is that from the lived experience of these people, it's clear that they somehow, and not necessarily like, hey, this is what I feel or what I think, but coming out of this particular way of analysis of the stories, of the life stories, their experience tells me these outcomes. And the first one is nature exists in itself. And so, several interviewees made a distinction between the reality and the pseudo-reality. And they refer to reality as nature, as being in nature, and pseudo-reality as culture, as being in the city, as having a job, paid job, working in the economy. They clearly said and felt that culture in that way is more pseudo compared to being in nature. And we can, if you like, discuss it a bit in a few minutes, but I'll give a few more outcomes. Another one clearly was that nature thinks about humans. So here are two nice pictures where that's illustrated. It was a clear outcome from analysis of the interviews that somehow people referred to that was their experience, that they are related to, that they're observed, that there's a reciprocity where, and this happens with dogs, with sheep, with foxes, with other animals. They felt that they were observed and that nature somehow thinks about them. Another result was that they felt that somehow nature wishes to be made social. So they felt something like, okay, they had a big experience, a storm or something happened with cows. They had to tell about it. So you, most of the time you think, oh, that's somebody who wants to just share with a friend. But they felt that it was nature telling them to talk about this, to share that experience. And another one was that they expressed that they needed to be multicultural, but that had to do with living in nature, for instance, these herders, but then in the winter with other people. And they felt like the translators, or they felt like lost in translation. They felt like they were multicultural and in more than one culture. This is I have more there, but there's a couple more findings that I want to also. If you then look in the book and how I worked through all of that, I made a distinction. I clearly felt a distinction on types of relating, types of relationship. And some of these are very well known or mainstream, and others are not. I'm actually starting with the ones that are not. So one type of relationship is the body-subject level. So this body-subject level, Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher who was a phenomenologist, who wrote a lot about nature, his recognition at the level of an expressive, knowing body and meaning-making that influences the world, vice versa. It describes the bodily knowing of nature. At this level, there's an organic, visceral dynamic. It's communication using one's animalistic capacity. Several people expressed awareness or direct experience like that. So this is a first type of relating to nature that came out of the interviews. Now I don't know how to go to the next slide. Probably like, oh, yeah. And then there's a level of call. This was actually an example of Daniel the herder, who felt that he was called to do something about this danger of the people wanting to build a dam. So an entrepreneurial level. Here people are explorers when it comes to nature, while at the same time they need to connect to culture. But it's a level of call. Then there's a cooperative level. It's clear that in these examples, the people that I interviewed spoke about non-human animals or nature as a companion, as yeah, a subject, an individual that you can communicate with. Then there's a differentiating level, and this is where you start to differentiate between all the elements in nature or the different animals and plants. And so there were clear stories again about individual dogs or individual cows, and the differentiating level is another way of relating, or another type of relating and relationship. Then you come to the management level. At this level, human culture is dominant. Nature is understood to be forceful, but activities are more directed by technology and science, seeing nature as complex, but as needing to be controlled, instead of knowing nature through lived experience. So, for instance, on these Alps again, those are commons. So they are not owned by anybody individually, but through the collective. A lot of these commons still exist in Switzerland, for instance, where I was. But why are they commons? Because there's too high up for machines to be employed and deployed. So, because as soon as a machine could go somewhere, it would be a different story. And then you see how the management level and the power of the humans and using a machine takes over. And the last one is the ownership level. I have a bit of a cynical picture with crabs in the supermarket being owned and being sold for food. So what? Invisible Nature, title of this presentation. The takeaway is that I learned that I need to look at non-human others and nature as agents, having agency. I also learned to look at non-human others, nature, in a sense of reciprocity. And in order to make sense, I have to put focus on the lived experience, as the lived experience in terms of an embodied knowing creates the meaning. So I've learned that knowing and meaning are closely related, but in doing this kind of research may be different. There's a lot of knowing, and especially in science and our practices, or also, I guess, what you do, we know things. That's why we use ontologies, epistemologies. We know literature. We are part of a certain focus or a certain group, and we build and build and build on the knowing. And that's all fine and important, and that's how it works. But I've found out that if you look at the lived experience, and if you look from a phenomenological angle, you not immediately interpret or use the knowing that you know, but you make yourself being open for what does it mean if this dog high on the Alp that I've just asked to do something with the cows starts to do something different. What does that mean? And if I then understand that this dog is an agent, or if there's reciprocity, I can also start to look at the meaning of what happens in our relationship, that now suddenly the dog is not doing what I'm asking the dog to do. And that's interesting and very important in a way of relationship, and in a way of figuring out and understanding what's actually happening. Thank you very much. Are you still there?
Rembrandt. Yes, yes, we are.
Okay,
so thank you for your presentation. I think this is a sort of some interesting reflections from the point of view of experiences of nature, predominantly in a Western world sort of situation. And so I think how we're going to go about this is I'm going to ask her one question. I think Luan might want to ask one. You let me know, Luan. And then we will open to the audience if they have any questions. So I wanted to ask you, we know you mentioned the indigenous world and teachings from the indigenous world instead of in passing. But in some accounts, and here I'm referring specifically to Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is from the Potawatomi indigenous group. She has teachings about cultures of gratitude, and through that they explore the concept of reciprocity, which is something you talk about in the book. And this reciprocity meaning one that is beyond linear cost-benefit accounts of human-nature relations. They propose a framework that uses the concept of biocultural ethic. It's that mixes together symbolic, biophysical, institutional, and social political dimensions of reciprocal contributions. So I wanted to ask you, what's the role of these biocultural relations in your book, and these relations and their capacity to foster reciprocity? I think you were going there when you were mentioning the story of Daniel and his relation to herding in the Alps, but I kind of missed this relationship that Daniel had with that land specifically, and how that drives his what you call a call to defend the land from people that wanted to, corporations that wanted to build a dam. So can you reflect a little bit whether this aspect of biocultural relation comes out in your book, and how does that relate to building reciprocity between human and nature?
Right. I'm not sure I can, but my immediate association or response to that is that when I started research, I did extensive reading and figuring out what actually is the ontology or epistemology I prefer or I belong to, as one is told to do if you do a PhD. So the first thing I found out was to look into existing literature and make a rough distinction in these ontologies. And there were 4 that I found, but they are never isolated, so they overlap, and they're also time bound because they shift, and they can be used in different contexts and by different people. So for instance, I then made a distinction between natural science, a positivist, reductionist way of understanding nature, and there are all kinds of assumptions what nature is in order to do that, but I'll keep it rough. The second ontology was ethic, in the sense that ethics has clear things to say about relating to nature, especially when it is about sustainability. We have examples of light green, green, dark green ideas about ethics and nature. A guy called Fox writes about that. And the third ontology I found was, in fact, the spiritual, or what I also connected to was contemplation. The spiritual and contemplation ontology is, for instance, also promoted by a guy called Arne Naas, who's a Norwegian philosopher, quite well known, who says that if you grow up in nature and you get older, you start to expand your ego or yourself to include more of your surrounding, more of nature. So your spirit grows. You're able to contain or to expand wider than when you started as a kid. Nevertheless, I made the choice to go with the fourth ontology, which is the phenomenology and the perception and the body. And I think I was fascinated or made a focus there because it helped me to put in the non-human others as actors. Because for me, what was so fascinating about Merleau-Ponty is that in his idea about relating to nature, he says the meaning is in the relation. The meaning is in between. The meaning is carried by an encounter. The meaning is carried by something that happens between actors. And this I felt fascinating because I felt it was an opportunity to really give value to non-human others and nature as an actor, as individuals or as culture or as politics in its own accord, by its own right. And that was what I focused on. And I left the other ontologies, including the spiritual. Yeah, I realized they are connected, and there's nobody who is that sterile that they are just one or the other. But I felt that this ontology needed to be explored also to, and we can contest about it or we can debate it, to go beyond the anthropocentric, to really make sure that the non-human other and nature can be seen or can be understood as existing, not because we tell them to exist, but they do exist on their own account. So
Rembrandt, we're losing, seems a bit the connection. Can you hear me? No.
yeah, we're running out of time. The conversation I had. Oh, the internet's unstable. Do you still hear me?
Yes,
Yes, you're
we
back
can.
now. We do.
Sorry, I already thought you didn't like what I said, but it was something different. The point I'm trying to make is that the conversations I had with Daniel, they were not in a spiritual way, the way I understand spiritual, and I'm not an expert in that, as a higher meaning or a call in a sense of a higher meaning, or maybe even something religious. That was not what he told me. What he told me was that it was care. It was caring because of the others. It was caring for the others. It was caring for the cow. Phenomenological analysis of recognizing and learning to work with the non-human others as agents. So for him, there was no doubt that he was dealing with individual cows, individual dogs, and that, you can expand it to a spiritual or an ethical, or even maybe a natural science dimension as well. But for me, I felt I was able to say things about that or to understand that from this phenomenological position.
Clear. And I think that, in some ways comes closer to ideas of empathy, kinship, and sense of place.
Yeah, but also, yes, sure, that's true. But also as a dialogue, as a yeah, and he and his companions, and I don't think it was because they were mad or psychotic or totally lonely on top of the mountain, but they communicated with these dogs or with these cows. So for them that was not something out of their own thinking or out of their own imagination. It was something where they were partners. Only the partners were not people.
Clear. Luan, do you want to ask one question? We are 10 minutes, 10 minutes left, and then I see there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, I think we can address the 2 questions in the chat. Yeah.
All right, cool.
There are two questions in the chat.
Yeah, so Cheryl is asking, did you explore the hypothesis of biophilia?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can I can be helpful here. It does remind me of a conversation I had the other day with researchers from Nijmegen University that told me that people are not split off or disconnected. So because inburst or already present feeling of being connected or loving or biophilia from the start, that was the premise or the assumption also of these people in Nijmegen, the researchers. And so they explain cultural bias or risks because of climate or destruction of nature. They explain that as a sort of learned behavior, whereas underneath or in the core, there's always biophilia. That's an interesting conversation, but I don't know what to say more about that. Only that I haven't done that kind of research, so I couldn't confirm if I feel that's right. If people, no matter what, have a love for nature from the start, or as part of being human. I don't know. I do know about the hypothesis, and yeah, I have my thoughts about it, but let's not say more.
And then another question from Elizabeth, who's asking, were any of your interviews conducted in urban green spaces or densely populated parks? She's wondering how people responded or might respond to your first question, asking a narrative of how they got to where they were in that moment when asked in urban green spaces.
Yeah, very good question. I'm also aware that the research, although it's empirical, quickly loses value because there's so much going on and things develop fast and go fast. Cities are no longer what they were 5 years ago. But anyhow, I think yes. There were a couple of interviewees who were not brought up in the countryside, but were brought up in cities. I think that some of the clearest comments were from somebody who is an advocate, and he was very concerned about his kids, who were not having so much opportunity to play in the countryside or outside as he had as a kid. He was really angry about that. If I feel like do people subscribe to the results that I just shared? I think that in cities you will find people that will confirm these kind of outcomes, but maybe you have to look a little bit better to find them. Because when I started, and my first question was, as an organizational consultant, curious if leaders of corporates are affected, or how they are affected by nature, or what does that mean for their leadership. It was very difficult to find somebody that could really give me a story. I remember interviewing an IT director, and what he said was that, yeah, what I know about nature, I had an uncle who liked birds, and as a kid I've joined him twice, and I thought it was boring. So that was somebody that I didn't pursue further. And then I started to realize maybe I need to look at different kind of practices where people somehow already are interested or have experience or have a practice working in or with nature. Sorry, I'll stop here before. Yeah. So I think the answer here is yes, there are people that you can find, but maybe it's a bit more difficult.
There was one more question in the chat. We do have 4 minutes, so if we can get like a quick response from you, that would be great. Anna is asking, I'm curious about consciousness. Do you think, and this might not be a quick answer, I'm curious about consciousness. Do you think nature is aware of its agency, knowledge, and experience? What would your strategy be to convince people to respect this agency, knowledge, and experience, even if it may not be conscious in an anthropogenic sense?
Well, that question basically rephrases or reformulates or summarizes my own interest and where I came from as a practitioner of group learning from a psychosocial, psychoanalytic position. The psychoanalytic theory in group work, in organizational work, has this as a truth, as a reality, that there is an unconscious that works in organizations between people, and that there are certain ways of getting access to that, although never all the way, otherwise there would not be an unconscious. The unconscious in that way is forever to be explored. But there is a lot of work done in organizations, starting from Freud to the object relations and the modern ones, that talk about these things. And one of the guys to remember is Wilfred Bion, who talks about basic assumptions. The basic assumption is what organizations share in relation to the outside. It's basically a defense. It's a way of thinking about the world that makes you feel secure or helps you to survive, but it's not necessarily how the world is or what the outside is. So a basic assumption in the first sense of Wilfred Bion, it's changed a little bit, but that was how he came about, because he worked with people from the war that came back, and the British government said, hey, we need to work with these soldiers. They need to be cured, healed, because we don't have enough soldiers. They need to go back to the war. And he developed this basic assumption theory, worked psychoanalytically with groups, and found out that there were these basic patterns that people in groups could share in order to deal with the outside. So the unconscious for me is a reality. And my interest was to expand that to include non-human others, nature, the environment. So I fully think that there is a consciousness in nature. The people that started to write about that is Theodore Roszak, who started ecopsychology, ecotherapy, And especially in the area of the psychoanalytic practitioners, there are people exploring this and writing about it and researching it. One person is Susan Long. She's a professor in Australia. She's also working on this. Yes, this is interesting and forefront of where this ideas and this kind of research goes, that we can also acknowledge the consciousness in between non-human others and in nature.
Thank you so much, Rembrandt, for sharing your point of view and your book with us. I just wanted to give a little space for Luan in case there's any NATURA announcement that we want to give to the crowd that are still here with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the thought-provoking presentation and discussion. Thank you everyone for engaging with this incredible topic. Rembrandt, I think you have opened many amazing drawers, if I can call it that way. And I regret we only had time to scratch the surface of many questions you have proposed to us. So I think the best thing we can do now is to get your book and get into it. So I put it in the chat. I'm gonna put it again, Making Nature Social. And I really, really cannot wait to read it. So thank you. We're going to close the webinar. If any of you is willing to present at a future webinar, please get in touch with Tessa, Veronica, or myself. The next webinar will be on December 10th at the same time. And we will welcome Charlotte Stirnen, who is a former NATURA fellow, and she will speak about her fantastic research on the daylighting of Tibet's Brook Park in Yonkers. And that's it for today. Thank you, everyone. And until then, be well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so